A man stood with a quivering sign in his hands on the chilly streets of New York, about to lose a final remnant of. I hoped the sign was scribbled with strong characters. Please aid, I was wrong. His face looked pallid. People hurried past him, their eyes set forward, refusing to acknowledge his presence, his filthy and ragged coat barely protecting him from the stinging cold. But that day someone noticed him. Despite his fame, Robert Dyro observed a man among the sea of uninterested faces when he turned from his daily stroll. He was well aware of life's harshness and had seen injustice repeatedly. Yet something was visible in this man's eyes. He saw wrath, betrayal, and a persistent fight beyond desperation. He moved closer, squatting slightly to meet the man's gaze, and said in a steady, quiet voice, "You say you've been wronged. Tell me what happened." I worked at a tire factory for 12 years, Robert, and he listened intently that day when the machine malfunctioned. I went call my supervisor, but no one was there, so I tried to shut it down myself. But it started up again, and the man lifted his trembling hands. The man's voice was rough with emotion, and his eyes were wet. But he started to speak, and so the cry of a man abandoned by the world finally reached someone willing to listen. His left arm appeared thin, weak, and frail. Robert saw the calluses and deep scars. These were the hands of a man who had once worked tirelessly, but now they appeared worn from carrying the weight of life itself. My arm got caught, and I screamed, but no one came. I went through that ordeal for 5 whole minutes, during which time my flesh was crushed between the machine's gears, my muscles were torn apart, and I could actually hear my bones cracking. Robert's jaw tightened, and his fists were clenching uncontrollably. Eventually, another worker heard me, and he turned to face Robert. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears, but he didn't cry, as if he'd run out of them. I went to hospital, and the doctor told me that my arm would never fully recover. The real shock came when I got back to work, and the man laughed bitterly, but his voice trembled. They called me into the office, and the manager didn't even say, "Get well soon." The factory blamed me for the accident, saying that I was at fault for my carelessness, and they immediately fired me, throwing away 12 years of work like trash. Robert gritted his teeth in rage, but that wasn't the worst part. At first, I thought things would improve. Perhaps I'd find another job or get some insurance help, but nothing happened. At home, my wife started to look at me differently. She used to love me, but after I lost my job, she saw me as a burden. Now, she said, "How are you going to put food on the table with that useless arm?" Every day I felt smaller. Every day I was crushed a little more. She wasn't my wife anymore. She was a stranger. The man swallowed hard. One day, I went out to look for work, and when I returned, the house was deserted. She had packed her bags and left. All she left was a note saying, "Get a life because I don't want to live with you anymore." Robert's face hardened, and she left me. But after she did, things only got worse because I was unable to pay the rent on my own. My landlord knocked on my door and said, "If you can't pay, get out." I knelt down and pleaded with him for more time, but he refused to give me another chance. I thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen, and I thought losing my wife was the worst thing that could happen to my house. But nothing was worse than living on the streets. Robert turned his head slightly, wondering how people could be so cruel. The man took a deep breath and exhaled heavily before continuing. Robert spoke softly about what transpired. The man averted his gaze and shook his head, saying, "People no longer see you as human." One day, I was starving, and I walked into a restaurant with few coins in my hand. I told the cashier, "Just a bowl of soup, please," and she looked me up and down. Then, security arrived and threw me out like I was a thief, not even getting the soup. A day earlier, I worked a factory, and the next day, no one would even look me in the eye. People wrinkled their noses as they passed me, muttering, "Disgusting," and swallowed hard. Even though Robert's eyes tightened in silent rage, it wasn't the worst. The man was silent for a while, as though he were reliving everything. I was sleeping in a park one night, with a thin, frayed blanket covering me. My eyes had just closed when I felt someone yanking away, and as I looked up, I saw some teens laughing at me. Robert nodded slowly before the man clenched his fists and began beating me with punches and kicks, saying, "If you won't work, you don't deserve to live." They repeatedly struck my face, and I could still taste the blood, hunger, and despair. He drew a shivering breath and looked away. That night, I crept beneath a bene, my face smeared with blood, and nobody came to my aid. A man passing the following morning shouted, "People like you are what make the city unlivable," and then spat on me. Robert twisted his face slightly in an attempt to control the raging anger inside of him. This man had dedicated his life to serving his family and his country for years, and now he was being treated like a disease. Robert tightened his hands and met the man's gaze, saying firmly, "This won't end like this. I'm going to make this right." When the man glanced at him, hope appeared in his eyes for the first time in a long time, and perhaps this was the start of something new. Robert inhaled deeply before removing his phone. He said, "I'm not going to let this go." Calling his attorney, "Do we have a new customer?" His attorney said, "No, but justice must be served to someone." The man looked at Robert incredulously. "Really, you would do this for me?" he asked. After hanging up the phone, Robert paused for a moment and said, "Not just for you, but for everyone who's been wronged like you." The man didn't just need justice at this time. He also needed warm shelter and a glimmer of hope. "Would you like to stay with me for a few days?" he asked, and the man blinked in surprise. "I don't want to be a burden," Robert said. "Seeing you sleep on the streets isn't an option." Robert grinned. "This isn't charity, it's the right thing to do." The man's eyes welled up for the first time in years. Someone truly wanted to help him. "Okay," he whispered that night for the first time in what felt like forever. The man slept in a warm bed. The next morning, Robert's lawyer called back with promising news. This factory already has a history of violating workers' rights. If we push hard enough, we can get him compensation. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. "You mean I might actually get what I'm owed?" The lawyer nodded. "If you're ready to fight for it." "Yes." Robert leaned forward at the table. "Are you ready to fight?" The man hesitated for just a moment. Then, for the first time in a long while, there was a fire in his eyes. "Yes, I'll fight." The lawsuit was filed 1 week later. The factory failed to prove that the accident was the workers' fault. In the end, they had no choice but to pay him compensation. But Robert wasn't done yet. When the case was settled, the man held the check in his hands, his eyes filled with tears. This is the first step to getting my life back." Robert grinned. "You need a new future, not just money." The man stared at him, perplexed. "What are you saying?" The man's eyebrows sprang up as Robert slipped a piece of paper across the table that read, "I found you a job." Robert smiled. "What kind of job is appropriate for your skills?" The man closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This time, he was crying with joy. "I never thought I deserved this." Robert put a comforting hand on his shoulder and said, "You didn't get lucky, you just took back what was already yours." That day, a man who had lost everything was given a second chance at life. A car service center needs a consultant, and someone with your experience is exactly what they're looking for.